4 is just a quick look at who are these kids and the changes in our schools, and certainly in the kids and families and stuff. Just a little spin around of who will be around you and who you'll be serving. And of course, one of the things that's difficult to account for is by location, geography, and stuff like that. You could be in a school from a high-income area and have one set of problems and issues, and be in a downtown low-income area and have a whole other set of issues. So this chapter 4 will be that spin and look around. Well, welcome to the first of the second part of our lessons on learners and their needs, and this one specifically is on the profiles of the learners themselves. First of all, we're going to talk about the views of youth. As society changes, as innovations change the way individuals perceive the world and view reality, there will be changes in values, aspirations, aptitudes, and attitudes of the young. And that's so interesting about this, and I could give a whole long thing on how values have changed. And just let me give you a quick hit just in my lifetime. When I was growing up, went to a school that was what we'd say for the most part pretty homogeneous, meaning we were all the same, came from the same backgrounds, had the same types of values, and knew everybody in our small rural schools. Not only that, we knew all the other kids in class, we knew all the other families. Not only my parents knew all the kids, they knew all the families and extended families, of course, in those small rural schools. Today, in my schools, where my kids go to school, I really don't know the kids in my children's class, and I certainly don't know their families or their parents. We just don't have that sense of community, and that is a huge change, because we quickly find is a lot of these families and kids' values are very different than ours, have a very different approach to the world and raising kids and those types of stuff. And so with that too, the attitudes have really changed. And so with you, to become an effective teacher, you got to be prepared to respond to those questions of students, the different behaviors and attitudes. You must understand the youth of today. And you're, of course, closer to their age than I am, but it's a big change. Let me take you a quick look of what the chapter looked like, and this is from your textbook on page 85. And we're first of all going to look at these views over here, of course, but then we will take a look at the learners' families, poverty, minority groups, violence, learners in violence, very young, disabilities, neglect, at risk, and even school-to-school mobile students. And then we'll look at the different developmental stages. You'll look at different developmental stages, and then about the efficacy of students. So here's some focus questions. Who are the learners today in our schools? How may teaching practices be influenced by the diversity reflected in our classroom? When do students and who are share certain common characteristics? And when might you expect students with such great diversity to have characteristics that converge, be the same? Why is it important for teachers to help students develop a sense of self-efficacy? And what teacher characteristics seem to be associated with learner success? And which characteristics might be prepared to respond to in these ways? So first of all, let's search for that truth. Learners in schools today are diverse, yet they have certain common characteristics. A teacher, you'll find, fulfill your responsibility at the workplace that brings together a cross-section of American population. Many attitudes and perspectives will be represented in your classroom. Diversity will add interest and challenge to your teaching career. And like I say, it's dramatically different than it was a short time ago. And this will be a lot to do with your success and your happiness in school, is how well you are prepared and ready to respond to these things in your school and in your classroom. So here's some of those characteristics that we're going to look at in this chapter, and here's those different views of youth. And let me quickly take you back here. So this is here your varying impressions of it is, how are they different? It'll be up to you how you perceive school, how they do. And the textbook does a nice job of really breaking it into two different views. And so what are those views? Well, first one, that our students today are overindulged, self-centered. under supervised, and we had a big thing here that we don't hear much now, but it was big, and then we call it the latchkey kids. And latchkey kids, of course, means they came home to empty houses. They let themselves in with a key, and of course we find the crime rate for school-age children is the highest between 3:30 and 6 p.m. And of course that corresponds with this time when they're home and the parents aren't home. We would view maybe a little out of control, preoccupied with self-gratification, disdain for societal institutions, analyze overpaid personalities that are rude, exhibit and antisocial behaviors. Now, I think you would have a hard time disagreeing that this isn't representative of some of our kids. And I certainly feel in my house that a little of this is part of my view of exactly where my kids come from sometimes. But let's go over and look at view 2. That they'll face challenges not present years ago. They have a reduction in the number of drug and alcohol users. Teen pregnancy has declined. Many students work. We revere institutions, parents prize also, like church and schools. And parent teachers are role models. And I feel that some of these things are a return, that we're returning to these things from just a few years back, that our families, our institutions become aware of this. And so we look at these two views, and which view represent yours, or most like your view of our children today. And I'm thankful to say that my kids more fit into this category, I think, than the other view. Okay, and you'll want to read more about this in the textbook. It has a nice step through here. But this part here is where I really want to bring you into, and that is this searching for the truth in these two views. And you'd please read this. You're going to want to walk through some of this. It gives some pretty heavy data here. Let me just read if I can. Also interesting to note that student aspirations have changed. This is revealed in student expectations for post-secondary ed. The proportion of students expecting to attain a bachelor's degree increased from 19% in 1981 to 34% today. So 34% of our graduates, at least in this research done in 2003, expected to get some kind of a bachelor's degree. And those expect to attend graduate school increased from 16 to 35%. Percentage did vary according to economics, and we'll refer to this a lot in the textbook, or a lot in our discussions here, and that is the SES, the social economic status. And of course that's referring to high income, middle income, low income. So from here on we'll have this SES, and you'll know what that stands for. But students in the high SES families had a slightly higher expectation of attaining a bachelor's degree. However, high SES students were more than twice as likely to expect to attend graduate school. Okay, and so that's more common for people from high SESs. And about 53% of high income and 53% of high income thought they would go to graduate school, while only 22% are from low income families. So that's just some stuff there that comes from and this chapter does a pretty good job about talking about that vacillation between high-income families or normal-income families and low-income families, and how that changes. Though the attitudes of young people and key issues do not seem to deviate markedly those many adults, we need to keep in mind that data represents averages of a huge group, about 50 million young people in our schools. So that's important. So now we'll go into these characteristics of today's families. Well, first of all, how about the families, the learners' families? Well, obviously, you don't have to be a rocket science and research guru to know that our two-parent households are a minority now, that we almost have as many blended houses, families, as we do traditional. Traditional being the same, a man and a woman raising all the children in the house that belong to both of them, that are theirs, not some blend of that. And so there's less than half of the families in our schools in this country now fit that category as traditional. Now, of course, it's not every school. I taught in a low-income school where it was way, 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 way below 50%. I'm going to guess below 25%. There's also some average income or other high-income schools where way, way, way above the 50% would be the traditional family. So how did it change? Well, between 1979 and 2003, the number of children who speak a language other than English at home increased from 3.8 to 9.9. Now, that's not a very long time. It's about 15 years, 14 years that it tripled in that time. That's a big jump in non-English speaking families. Okay. And parents from higher SES households are more likely to have some contact with their children's school. And again, to me, there's no doubt about that. Is the average or high incomes will have more contact with the school than from low income families. But you knew that. And then generation communication has decreased. Right? I was raised very close to one set of grandparents until they died. Now it's not unusual at all, and we see this in our neighborhood here. As we look around our neighborhood, there's very, very few people in the neighborhood who have grandparents in the area that see their grandparents very often. That's another change in our families, that we are not raised, the generations aren't around, that we see grandparents, but we don't live near them. And we're finding some technology to help us stay connected, but it's definitely a change in family. It's definitely a change in learners' families. That's one group. How about poverty? Well, the textbook is saying 1/4 of our nation's children live in poverty. So what does that mean? Well, I think state to state they decide, the feds get to decide, but we decide what level income, and I think it's right now around $23,000 is a poverty line, and that is for, I think, a household of four, a household of 2, 3, or something like that. Let me just take a peek at this. Okay, I'm a little mistaken on this, as you'll see here. If there's a household of 1, it's this amount, and it has an Alaska and Hawaii, but we'll look at here. 2 is 14, 3 is 17. And so whenever we hear poverty, right here it is. And this family in a household does not necessarily mean people, father and children, or father and mother children. This can be a blend of those, but if they're considered from the same household, and this is what free and reduced lunches are built on. This is what free healthcare is built on. Everything that we talk about for poverty or low income is based on these numbers right here for the feds. This is for the feds. Okay. So that's what we have, and they say 1/4 of our children, and our children, of course, are the biggest group. Children are the biggest group that live in poverty. Of any other facet we looked at, children are the biggest group of poverty people. And households with that include minority children in high school and headed by a female are especially likely to be impoverished. It's a little politically incorrect to say, but the biggest group is this. If there's minority children in the high school, and they're headed by females, especially likely to be impoverished. Why that is, we could go on for an hour about that. Then disadvantaged learners have problems with cognitive development, vocabulary, reading, even technology. Their access to technology is less than other folks. And here's interesting too, a dropout rate in low SES homes is 11%. And of course, that's an average. Some areas, I know on our reservations in South Dakota, it's higher than that, higher dropout rate than 11%, around 25. Okay. Well, how about these minority groups then? Let me just take one more look at something. This is interesting. Also, here on page 89, that would be a good read for you. Been an increase in the educational level of parents over the past couple decades. In '79, a percentage of school-age children who had parents who had graduated from high school rose from about 76% to about 88% in 2001. Okay, and so that is an increase, a nice increase there. And the percentage of parents who had at least a bachelor's degree from 19% in 1979 to 31%. And so that too is a significant increase there. Okay, reflects the increasing level of parent education by indicating the percentage of 20 to 29-year-olds who completed high school. Okay. And also here it talks about because of the increased education, more of these families are involved in the activities at school and communicate more often with the schools. Okay, and here this also is current family and employment statistics indicate that large numbers of school children spend many hours with babysitters and at daycares, and this kind of generation-to-generation communication that went on in the past happens with less frequency. So what does that mean? Why does that matter if we have less generation-to-generation communication we had in the past? Well, because now the schools pretty much are asked to provide that personal information and social skills and storytelling and learning that grandparents used to provide. Now the schools are asked to provide that. Many of life's lessons were learned at the knees of grandparents in past generations that no longer exist, especially in our single-parent families. There's not time to teach that. So that's one of the ways that we're going to ask you as teachers to be more involved, is that you'll have to provide that personal information that in the past was passed on by parents. Mom was home or there was grandparents involved. Now our kids are raised by babysitters and daycares. So let me just talk a little bit more about these poverty and learners. Poverty and learners. If I can again just read this to you on page 90. For many reasons, children from economically deprived homes often do not do well in school. Disadvantaged learners have difficulty with cognitive development, vocabulary, and reading, as we had on the notes. Too many of these learners are assigned to special education classes because of cognitive and developmental deficiencies. Many of these problems result because of mothers' inability to pay for quality prenatal care. Also, poor children often do not receive adequate diets, which may affect the performance in school. What's with their diets? Well, for the most part, I've been involved with this many times, and that is providing food to food pantries and food to poverty people. And you cannot believe how bland those diets are compared to what middle income or high income people, where we eat fresh fruits and vegetables and quality food. They pretty much eat the starches, the rices and beans, and the kids just never have the same kind of food as others. This reflecting the dropout. Let's see, what are we at here? Do they pay for that? Often receive adequate diets, effective performance in school. This reflected in the dropout rate of students. The dropout rate of high school students living in low-income homes is about six times that of the others. And so that's a big concern in poverty schools, is the dropout rate is so much higher. Okay, and failure to these learners to develop, jumping around here. The dropout rate is 11%. Peers living in low, the rate, it was about 11% dropout rate for students living in income families, low income, 5% living in middle income, and only 2% for high income families. Did you know that? Many of the economically impoverished learners you teach will come from homes that lack personal computers. Large numbers of poor families cannot afford a newspaper or magazine subscriptions that we take for granted in our homes. Poor children are not nearly as likely to observe their parents reading as are children from more affluent homes. And because these learners seldom see their parents or guardians reading, they find that some of them fail to understand the importance that you attach to reading. And fail these learners to develop good reading things. So they fail to pick up those reading things. And this is another thing that comes with this. It was said one time that the average student coming to school from middle income will have had 500 different books read to them before they come to school. In some of these homes that come from poverty, there'll be less than 5 may have been read to them in the home prior to that. And we beat this to death. Why is it important to read to children in those early developmental years? Well, because it gives them language. It broadens their language. Very hard to read and learn and use words that aren't part of your vocabulary. And so that was the big thing with why and these are. And it says here that the parents fail to read, that the role model in the home is a lot less likely to read or value reading as a regular part of their life. And of course, there's some other things go with that, and that is these parents from these impoverished homes tend to be undereducated also. They tend to be the group that doesn't have a high school, didn't finish high school, those types of things. So now let's talk about these minority groups. Well, are becoming a larger proportion, as we saw just a minute ago, back a few, about how that the group is changing. And this distribution from minority groups is not uniform across the country. Specifically, in our pocket here, minorities are still very underrepresented compared to other parts. And minority, with exception of some Asian heritage, often have not adapted well to school programs. Isn't that interesting? Now, that seems like a little bit of that seems like we assume a lot here, but this group here, and I know we have neighbors across the street that aren't even from this country, they have 3 sons and all are in the gifted program. We don't have anybody gifted in our house, and yet these Asians, so they don't fall. Everybody else, every other minority group tends to have difficulty with our school programs. Period. Bar none. All the minority groups have more problems than us Westerners, except the Asians. Scores of these minorities have lagged behind whites in achievement for years, and we keep looking at it, keep trying to figure out why that is, but it's not quickly coming. Well, school violence is a matter of great concern to educators, community leaders, law enforcement, and members of other groups. Involvement in physical fight without a weapon is the most common kind most people experience at school. In other words, fist fights, hand-to-hand combat. We get some media about weapons stuff, but a lot more fights. And of course, in our bigger schools, I went to small school, and I can't remember ever having a fight being there. But in our bigger schools, it's pretty common. But generally, it's some type of hand-to-hand thing. And then also with this high poverty and low poverty schools report about the same percentage of episodes of violence. Is that surprising that these would be the same? Well, that's what they found in this research in 2003 on violence. Well, characteristic associated with the school's climate, and that's a big term. When I was in graduate school, I studied a lot about schools' climate and culture that have been found to be associated with violence and antisocial behavior. Are these things? Overcrowding. Where's overcrowding? Well, for the most part, it's in our low-income downtown schools. Poor design and use of school space, lack of firm yet caring disciplinary procedures, learner alienation. Learner alienation, they often say, is what causes kids to bring guns and take things in their own hands. A lot of multicultural sensitivity can create some school violence problems. Teacher rejection, peer rejection. In other words, they don't have friends. We see this in our special ed kids sometimes. And student resentment of school routines. How can we prevent violence in our schools is what the study is from. Just don't like the structure. They're not used to structure like that in their life. And so it creates some problems. How about, this is a chance for you to go and take a look at the video viewpoint on One Last Chance about this charter school and the role that schools are trying to play in keeping these kids in school. And after you view this, I would like you to go to the wiki page, and under the discussion, I have posted a question about that for you to respond to. What role are you going to play in keeping students in school, considering what and where you'll be teaching? And so that will be the video viewpoint for you to discuss there. Well, then there's the very young learners. We have this increasing young children enrolled in child care facilities. Great debate about the quality of this care and whether or not it helps or harms children. And let's again go back to the textbook on this. What makes this interesting is we don't agree. We can't agree on what should be done, because we have more, as we talked about before, more and more of these households headed by single families, single mothers, and they feel like they need to work, and so we're continuing to look what we call affordable daycare, but really is the word cheap daycare, or for the most part for the people who live in poverty, free daycare. And there's constantly been a question about whether that's quality daycare or not, and so nobody has any real answers to that. And this is just a look at how the change in it, up a little bit from here, but as they get older, it gets a little bit more poverty status. That certainly these numbers come into play. And of course, the reason there's less kids in poverty in daycare is what? They're not working. This represents my class, the middle income people, where both parents work, and of course we daycared our kids to death, I call it. It's one of those regrets I have as a parent, that I wish I had quit my job and stayed home with my kids before they went to school, but can't change that now. Here's another group that you'll get to study collectively, and that's these learners with disabilities. And this is the group that I want to clue you into right now. Will be ever present also. This public law was the first one that was enacted in 1975. It was a federal law that said all kids are entitled to a FAPE, and the FAPE stands for a free, appropriate public education. And it didn't mean regardless of background or disability or anything like that. And roughly 13% of the total school population is considered to have a disability of some kind. And they include like specific learning disabilities or speech impairments, mental retardation, severe emotional disturbance, and by far the biggest group is this group with specific learning disabilities. Of all the kids with disability, that's about 46%, I think they're saying now, have learning disabilities. And there's a whole range of different disabilities, but these are some of the more common ones. Now, the one you don't see here is ADD or ADHD, because that's still not a recognized category in special ed, because kids tend to function in school with these disabilities without special ed, is why I believe there's not been a category added for that yet. But let me just take you out there and show you what we're going to do here. On the wiki site, look like this. First of all, I'm going to have some of you look at these characteristics of different learners. Looks like this, learners that families, learners in poverty. And what I'm going to ask you to do is come right in here on learners' families and put some information about those changes. And some of these can come right from our notes, but I'm going to ask you to put one image in here that represents this. Take this one out that I've put in here for Adam. Take this one out and put your own image of some kind that represents the change in learners' families, and then a link that supports that. Same here. Come down to poverty and learners. Give some information, and a lot of this can come right from our notes, and then an image that represents poverty and learners, and then a link. Minority groups, each of these, information goes in this space here. Put an image here, some kind of a picture that represents that, and then a link of where that supports your information. That's this one on characteristics. Okay, and this one here on learners with disabilities, same thing. That you're going to put some information about the characteristics of people with learning disabilities. You're going to take this picture out, and you're going to put your own picture or image in here that represents learning disabilities, and then you're going to have a link. Same here. Speech impairments, some information about the characteristics, an image, a link. Each one of these. Information about the characteristics. So all you have to do with learning with disabilities is what? The characteristics of that disability, and then an image that represents it, and a link. Okay. That's what we're going to do with this here. And I'm going to say to you, you are going to want to study these, because I'll be testing over both of these. There will be test questions about these different groups and the characteristics. Okay. Well, how about abused, neglected learners? Well, more children aged 4 and younger die each year of child abuse and neglect than from any other single cause. Did you know that? Yeah. And of course, who does this represent? Well, a lot of them, but the biggest group that that damages and kills kids are moms' boyfriends. Rarely is it the father. Sometimes it is, but for the most part, it happens in low-income families and where they're not married, and the father is not related to the children. Teachers have a legal obligation to report an injury or to a learner or that appears to be non-accidental, and about 3 million reports are made each year. Now, did you know that you have a legal obligation? Let's go back to the textbook about this. Now, here's what I wanted you to see out here under the part about abused children, and you're going to want to very specifically look at this also about these different areas. First of all, physical abuse and neglect is a very common one. Emotional abuse, and you'll want to look at these symptoms. There's some questions on the test about these, and you're going to want to have viewed all of this. Sexual abuse, okay? And here's my thing, and just my experience with this in my years of teaching, that by far the hardest I thought to pull the trigger on was neglect. What do you do if the kid comes to school every day and they're dirty and smell bad, and you can tell they haven't eaten, and they're always tired? And then you meet the family, you meet the mother, and she's the same way. And it's hard to know, and I tell you, several times I had to call on neglect, but it's a very, very touchy situation because so often the kids come from homes that don't consider things neglect. In other words, I looked at it with my middle class values and determined this kid was neglected, only to meet the family that they did not see it that way. And so you'll want to look this over really close. Let me just have a final word here on abuse and neglect also is you have an obligation to report this. And sometimes things don't happen really fast after you report that. And I had frustration more than once where I had reported this and doesn't seem like anything happened, and it's certainly not in a timely manner. And so one of the things I will say to you is just be careful, because you cannot unring a bell. Once you have rang the bell, you cannot unring it. So the first time you report this, it's hard to put it back in the bag. And I had a student one time that was in one of my classes at the university came and said that she was reported the child came to school with a mark, and she had a knock on the door that day, and it was Child Protective Services investigating a possible abuse at home, and she was devastated by it. And so it was quite interesting. So just know that, but you have a legal obligation to report this. And for the most part, if you suspect abuse, your school has some protocol of what to do. Your school has a procedure that happens, and that's one of the things that you ask when you're student teaching. Certainly start teaching, what do we do about suspected abuse? And you want to take care of this long before you have to deal with it. But what is our protocol? What happens when there's abuse, suspected abuse and neglect? Then we go into at-risk learners. And at-risk learners, there have some personal and situational backgrounds that place some risk at youth. Did you know that this group is more at risk? One-parent households are more at risk of failure. Parents who dropped out of school, and that was my experience. I worked with lots of kids that came from families that no one had finished high school. And then the low social economic status is also an indicator of kids might not be successful in school. High growth states where the population grows fast. Having those poorly developed academic skills, this one I think is kind of obvious. A low self-esteem person, and of course this one we've talked about already, is that second language group tends to be at risk for failure. And here's another interesting thing about this school-to-school mobility. again, big change in the last 10 years than it used to be. Half of all learners make at least one change. And I think, like here in Sioux Falls, all the kids make a change. None of our schools are K-12 for the most part. And so I don't know if that comes into play here. But they say, what is it, about 15 to 18% will change schools during any one given school year. Now, I taught in a low-income school, and it was more by like about 30%. But in average school, 15 to 18%. So what does that mean to you? Well, look out there and look at those people's eyes that first day of school, knowing, between 15 to 18% are going to look different at the end of the year. And I say where I was 30%, and this had a high representation of special ed kids. The special ed kids coming from low income were more transient than others. Some of the causes like overcrowding, legislation for class size can cause this. Expulsion is a big common reason that we go from one school to another. And this legislation allows parents and guardians to move from one to another. We here in Sioux Falls, or here in South Dakota, we call it open enrollment. Has allowed that. So we have a lot of school mobility. It brings lots of things with it. How do you orientate somebody? One of the things I say to you is have a plan. If you have somebody new in your class, have a plan for what's going to happen and how do you orientate them and get them up to speed. The other thing you find is they maybe have covered different stuff in school than you've covered, and they maybe be ahead or behind, but they certainly will be a challenge, because we find that kids that move are more likely to struggle than those that don't. And so you want to be prepared for that. Well, let's just take a look in the textbook. It talks about this mobile ability thing, but they're more than 3 times likely not to perform as well as academically and have more behavior problems than less people that change less. Young people who change schools frequently have lower rates of high school graduation than learners who change schools rarely or do not at all. I'm one of those freaks that I went first through 12th grade in the same school with the same kids. I had 90% of my classmates were the same in 12th grade as they were in first grade. Almost unheard of nowadays. Almost unheard of. And so you're constantly orientating, and I know my kids have went through this already, because each year they're in a different section. That our schools are multiple sections, and so even though you're in the same school, you have different kids around you each year. So you need to have a plan of how you're going to deal with kids that are new to your class and kids that are leaving your class. Try to learn about newcomers' past enrollments in history. It will be especially useful to find out what these young people were studying in their previous schools. In addition to checking the records that come to your school from the learners' previous buildings, you find it useful to conduct a personal interview with the learners, possible parents, guardians. You have gathered this information, find it necessary to develop learning materials for each of the transfer ones, those types of things. So now, these patterns of learner development. And this here just gives a little bit of a history of this pattern. Develop shaped eyes, how they should be educated to be responsible. You need to have your instructional procedures up to date. According to one early view, children, this is interesting, children were mindless creatures who were incapable of feeling or knowing anything. Interesting ideas about educational flow logic from this idea. For example, supporters of this view tended to dismiss proposals to spend money on early childhood education because they saw formal education for very young children as pointless. Adults' roles were limited to meeting children's physical needs and keeping them out of mischief. And for a long time, that's how we functioned. In the past, others saw children as essentially miniature adults. Aside from their small size, children were believed to have adult characteristics, lacking only knowledge and experience. This could be provided. It assumed that children would be able to discharge the roles at an early age. Learning materials designed for use by adults were seen perfectly appropriate for children. If children failed to learn, this failure was attributed to their laziness. Okay, so that's some of the history here of why we started to study child development. And at our university, we call it, human growth and development, because these early things they found were erroneous. These early attitudes about teaching kids. from they're just little mindless, empty things that'll get the experience they need, will become smart, to the next view was, gee, they have all the things they need, they just need the information experience. And still another historical perspective maintained that children came into the world totally lacking any personality or of their own, and they may simply animated clay or putty waiting for appropriate modeling by adults. This was the assumption that young people, when appropriately guided, would turn into good citizens. In school, this view resulted in educational practices that were planned and delivered exclusively by adults. Children's interests weren't considered at all. Well, most of these views of their history have not stood up well in the rigors of modern times. Okay, so with that, we started to study that developmental processes. What is the development like at the different stages? And so you are going to get to look at this a little bit, as I'm going to ask some of you to take a more regular look at this, like kindergarten learners, those types of things. Okay. And each of these things, not historical views, I'm not going to ask you to look at that because I kind of gave you that, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things that I'm going to ask some of you to do with this. Back on our wiki page, it comes under this here about patterns of development. And again, I'm going to ask you to put an image here. Take this one out I put in, and find an image that represents this group. And then, for example, Sandra has this about preschool to kindergarten, and address each of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things, and have a link that supports that. Okay, and some of this can come out of your textbook, of course, but the link has to be outside the textbook. And here we're going to deal with all. Again, you're going to want to study this because there's some questions on the test about these different developmental ages, those different developmental stages. Grades 1 to 3, 4 to 6, 7 to 9, 10 to 12, and preschool to kindergarten. Okay, so you'll be building this knowledge here for the rest of us to study. Okay, that's what's coming in this here. Then, the last part of this is developing a sense of efficacy, a belief that someone's existence matters and that they are capable of making important contributions to the world. And this is what we say is an important attribute of a teacher, is to believe that all children need this sense of efficacy, and education will help develop that in them. And that's why we study that, and that's why we see that as being important. Wants to believe that they are worthy and capable of learning. Big thing with our SPED kids is continually reinforcing this. Because when I saw these kids, by the time they got to middle school, they didn't believe this anymore. As a teacher, you'll confront learners who have varying personal characteristics. As an instructional leader, you also need to think about your own sense of efficacy in working with these kids. To pursue this purpose, you should reflect on the kinds of expertise you need to help learners you teach. Sources of that information and may help you, and specific sources you take to acquire the knowledge you'll need to operate a secure, confident, and competent professional. We still find the number one thing that affects kids' learning is the teacher. And that's why we see pockets, even in our poverty schools where kids do well, we often find a very good teacher. And the last thing is another video viewpoint that is on the opinion page, and that is this about these robotics and immigrations, that these group of kids that are legal immigrants do some cool things with the robotic things, and then are faced with some other stuff. And I'm going to ask you to again come back into the wiki and give your opinion on this right here, each of you, on this issue. Okay. All right. That's chapter 4. Who are these students?